Welcome back. This is the Voice of Russia in London. I'm Brendan Cole. Today, Iran's supreme leader has dismissed a US offer of one-to-one talks on Tehran's nuclear program. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei said the US was proposing talks while pointing a gun at Iran. On Saturday, the US Vice President Joe Biden suggested that direct talks, separate to the wider international discussions due to take later this month. But yesterday, the US widened sanctions on Iran, aiming to tighten a squeeze on Tehran's ability to spend oil cash. Iran has argued that its nuclear program is for energy generation and research. But critics believe the government is developing nuclear weapons. Earlier this week, I spoke to Dr. Saeed Hossein Mousavian. He was the senior nuclear negotiator for Iran between 2003 and 2005, and he gave me this view regarding the link between sanctions and Iran's nuclear program.
I really don't know how far Europe and US is ready for lifting the sanctions. I'm pessimistic because I do not see any potential in US domestic policy for lifting substantive sanctions. And as far as they are going to keep the main sanctions, then they should not expect Iran to respond with concessions.
The 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, plus Germany, have held a series of negotiations over the years. Iran is expected to attend another round of negotiations on the 26th of February in Kazakhstan. But will they end again with Iran demanding the West lift sanctions as a condition to any nuclear move, and the Western powers refusing? Well, to discuss this and the issues surrounding it, I'm joined in our London studio by Saeed Ali Alavi. He's an Iranian scholar and analyst, and we'll be joined by our guests in Washington and in Moscow a bit later on. I'd like to get your reaction, Saeed. What do you think of the Ayatollah's statement today with regard to dismissing the possibility of talking directly with the US?
Iran's supreme leader has drawn a clear and logical framework, and there are reasons for that. Iran had talks with the United States on Afghanistan in Bonn and on Iraq in Baghdad. And regarding nuclear, each time Iran clear an ambiguity, Tehran faces with new demands and allegations. It sounds like an ongoing and endless procedure. This is easy to put forward accusations, but proving them is another issue. The fact is the main issue and obstacle is mutual lack of trust. So also, Iran has offered beyond its obligations under the NPT. But for instance, Israel is irrationally convinced that Iran is a threat. And needless to mention that Israel has never signed the NPT yet.
The NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty?
Yes, absolutely. Mm-hmm. But we need to see after all these negotiations, and also I should say, Iran's supreme leader has had issued a verdict that manufacturing the nuclear weapon is forbidden in Islam. So all these negotiations, all these verdicts, and goodwill of gesture resulted in more tightened and imposing more sanctions on Iranian people.
Are you saying that the edict from the Ayatollah, who's the supreme leader of Iran, is not being listened to? The religious aspect of that it's against Islam, it's ungodly, or however you like to call it, that is enough, that would forbid any development of a nuclear weapon, and the West should be listening to that? Yes,
obviously, yes. And on the other hand, they have been ignoring, the Western Bloc, and particularly Washington, have been ignoring all this goodwill of gesture that Iranian government have been trying to do. But we need to also look into the sanctions from my point of view, because first of all, I should say, ordinary Iranians are the targets of Western imposed sanctions. Iranian people bear the heavy burden of undemocratic Western imposed sanctions in terms of particularly medicine and food shortage and money problems. The sanctions are indiscriminately targeting and harming the most vulnerable people, including sick and poor children, students, farmers, elderly. There are many families that have children suffering from cancer or other serious illnesses and have no access to appropriate medicine because of such inhuman sanctions.
Okay, well, look, I will touch a bit more on the issue of sanctions, but just with the statement today by the Ayatollah, it doesn't quite square with what Iran's Foreign Minister Ali Akbar Salehi said last week, where he welcomed the idea of talks later on this month in Kazakhstan. It did sound, from his perspective, that he said that Iran had no red lines, suggesting that they're prepared to come to the table. Perhaps they're prepared to come to some kind of deal, but it sounds like it's only going to be with the P5+1. It's not going to be in isolation with the US.
I mean, from my point of view, it seems that there is no any reason to have a bilateral negotiations directly with the United States, whereas although Iran had talks with the US on Afghanistan in Bonn and on Iraq in Baghdad, there was no any kind of tangible result out of it. So having negotiations with Iran, between Iran and 5+1 group talks, sounds more reasonable and sounds more logical.
Can we hold out that much hope, though, for those talks, given what the Ayatollah has said today, and perhaps the discrepancy between what he's saying and what Iran's foreign minister is saying?
As I mentioned, Iran's supreme leader drawn a clear frame and logical framework for these negotiations. Having such histories of going through all these negotiations and just facing more sanctions and tightened economic sanctions, giving us the idea of having negotiations with the United States, it seems not logical at this point, but never rejected any kind of negotiations with the European Union and 5+1 group talks.
Okay, well, look, we'll go to our Washington studio with Rob Sachs. Over to you, Rob.
Thanks so much, Brendan. Want to welcome Greg Thielman. He is Senior Fellow at the Arms Control Association. They've just put out a briefing book on efforts to resolve the dispute over Iran's nuclear program. Greg Thielman, welcome into our D.C. studios.
Thank you, Rob.
Wanted to see if you could respond to some of the things we heard from our guest in London, and maybe if you can assess the U.S. policy toward Iran. Has it been all stick and no carrot, and are we kind of in this catch-22 where you have to, loosen sanctions to get talks, or you have to get talks, you need more sanctions? We're at a deadlock here, almost.
Catch-22 is probably the right way to describe it. This is a very frustrating process, and Mr. Alavi was exactly right in identifying the lack of trust on both sides as one of the major hurdles to overcome. We unfortunately have a long history of unsuccessful attempts to resolve various problems between the U.S. and the Islamic Republic of Iran. And both sides have legitimate grievances about missed signals, about opportunities to achieve agreements that were not realized. I think the important thing right now in looking at where we're at, though, is to realize that both sides have to stop demanding the kind of agreement that they would most like to have, and realize that the only way we're going to get a negotiated solution here is to meet the necessary and minimal demands of each side to achieve an agreement. And in that context, I have to say that the recent comments of the Supreme Leader are disappointing. The U.S. is making a gesture here to signal that one-on-one talks would be useful, and it's something that fortunately even Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov has endorsed, which means that the door is really open to having direct talks. And in the past, the Iranians have signaled rather clearly that they cannot resolve this issue as they tried to in the early part of the decade when they were just negotiating with the three European powers. The United States is one of the key players here, and any kind of direct contacts, and I say this as a former diplomat, it's very hard to argue that the road to solution should not be traveled by way of direct talks between the two most important adversarial players. And that's what I think the United States is fortunately now willing to do. My final point, though, is that, as I said, both sides have grievances here, but one of the reasons that we're in this difficult situation is that the Iranians had a secret program for 18 years in which had military dimensions in it, which our own intelligence community says halted in the fall of 2003. But this is one of the things that makes it hard for the International Atomic Energy Agency to give a clean bill of goods. And in order to do that, we need greater transparency. The Iranians had in the past agreed to extra measures that many other countries have agreed to, like the additional protocol, and then they retracted it. Iran agreed to very specific obligations under the security arrangements that they negotiate with the International Atomic Energy Agency concerning the amount of advance notice when they build new facilities, and then they pulled back unilaterally, which no other country in the world has done that is now a member of the NPT in good standing. So Iran cannot demand special rights and opportunities under an international agreement.
Want to get our Moscow guest, Andrei Baklitsky, research fellow and head of the Russian Center for Policy Studies project, to weigh in specifically on the point that we heard Greg Thielman talk about, which is Russia endorsing one-on-one talks between the U.S. and Iran. Do you see this as the way forward? And if so, having the Supreme Leader say there's not going to be any direct talks, where does that put us?
Well, thanks for having me, first of all. I would like to stress that the Russian position was pretty clearly stated on a number of occasions. The Russian position is that any kind of talks, any way towards solving the problem is welcome. Be it in the six-party talks format or direct contacts, it doesn't really matter, because the main involvement of Russia is here, one as a mediator, one is trying to break the deal here. So when we are discussing the latest statement of the Supreme Leader, we should also take into consideration the internal dynamics of Iran at the moment, and not only the external factors. So if we pay attention to the politics of Iran, we can see that current president Ahmadinejad is a lame duck at the moment. He has less than 6 months at the moment before next elections, and he cannot run the next elections. So there is a clear power struggle in Iran internally, with one of the major players being Mr. Larijani, the Speaker of Iranian Parliament, who is probably gonna lead in the next elections, and the arrest of the former Prosecutor General of Tehran a couple of days ago, when he was held in prison for a number of hours, and he's a person who is thought to be close to Ahmadinejad, is clearly showing that something is going on in Iran itself. So when we see Mr. Salehi saying that yes, we will go in for talks, and then we see Supreme Leader who's dismissing the words of Salehi, who is, well, call it whatever you call it, is a man of Ahmadinejad, it can also mean some internal things in Iran rather than clear position against the talk with the United States. So I think we should pay attention to that. And basically, there are some good signs for the future talks. I've been discussing with the colleagues in the Foreign Ministry of Russia, and they look pretty optimistic about the fact that the talks are scheduled, that they're going to be held in Kazakhstan, which is probably a good way to do it, a country which is not aligned, the country which is, well, which done a lot of things for the non-proliferation and banning of nuclear weapons. So it might be some new possibilities there.
I'd just like to ask that question to Saeed Ali Alavi here in London. The point that Andrei Baklitsky made about Ahmadinejad, he's in the last few months of his term as president, and he was described there as a lame duck president, and there is this internal political squabbling. Do you think that's a hindrance to any kind of deal, in that if there's an election coming up in June and some kind of agreement is made, that wouldn't look particularly good to the Iranian people if it looks like they're bowing to the demands of the West? Or did you see that as a barrier, perhaps, to any kind of agreement done in at the end of February?
Agreement between...
Well, the agreement in Kazakhstan. If there is an agreement at the end of over Iran's nuclear program, how will that be presented back to the Iranian people ahead of an election? Will it look very good to the Iranian people, do you think?
What the Iranian people expect is to having a more transparent situation and more transparent negotiations and fruitful negotiations. Iranians are facing, as I mentioned, heavy sanctions. The Iran Supreme Leader is looking into the case beyond the internal competitions. He's hearing the voice of the ordinary people. The ordinary people, many, may say that Washington is to be blamed the most for its double standard policies and imposing harsh sanctions on Iranian people. And look into this case. Iranian people have been helping the world during the war on terrorism in 2001. Also, they have been playing a major role in reconstructing their troubled neighboring states, Afghanistan and Iraq, hosting millions of Afghans and Iraqi refugees since 1980s and 1990s. So they played a crucial role in terms of rebuilding surrounding area. But what they see is more tightened sanctions, more fruitless negotiations and slogans. And that reflects to the leadership. And leadership wants to respond to the ordinary people by saying that it should be better to have a transparent negotiations or not to have it at all, possibly, with the United States, On
the issue of sanctions, though, is it not convenient for the Iranian authorities to blame America? Whether the people of Iran think that America is culpable for enforcing these sanctions or not, it is convenient for the authorities in Iran to look at and say, look, it's America's fault. It's not our fault. It's nothing to do with us.
But obviously, if you live inside the country, you will see that if you have a child that is suffering from a serious illness and you need a medicine, that medicine is manufactured in the United Kingdom or United States, and you have no way to have access to it. Of course, logically, blame the Washington or the Western governments. Particularly, Western governments are championing and claiming to be the champions of the human rights. And on the other hand, the ordinary Iranian people are seeing something else. But there
are human rights issues in Iran, though, that have nothing to do with the United States.
Yes, but when we look at the sanctions, it's more tangible for Iranian people now because it's affecting the day-to-day life of the Iranian people. So what they see is, on one side, Washington is imposing tightened sanctions no matter how many negotiations Iran went through, no matter how many times Iran supported the world community, the global community, in terms of rebuilding Iraq and Afghanistan, in terms of helping the new governments in Iraq and new governments in Afghanistan, but still they are facing more tightened sanctions.
But would you accept that, be that as it may, and if you accept that premise, it does help the Ayatollah and it does help the powers in Iran to point at America and blame them for the situation that their people are in, regardless of these sanctions, because and it is a useful leverage, it's a useful political tool for them in terms of what they can bring to the table for negotiations with the West.
These sanctions are becoming serious obstacles and creating mutual lack of trust, particularly from the Iranian people's side. Iranian people's side are asking themselves to what extent we can continue and we just face more tightened sanctions. Yes, it does. It is logic. For Iranian people, they don't need someone to tell them, for example, you need to blame me or them, you blame, let's say, Washington, or you blame Tehran. They see these sanctions are imposed by the Western countries, are implemented by the Congress of the United States, unfortunately. And of course, they have that right to blame the United States and the Western countries to impose such harsh sanctions.
Can I get the response from our Washington studio to that?
Yes, there are a couple of points to make about sanctions. First of all, the sanctions have not happened out of the blue. It's true that the United States has been pushing hard for sanctions. It's also true that Russia and China are, in general, reluctant about the efficacy of sanctions. The significant thing is that we now have a situation since the UN Security Council resolution of a couple of years ago, in which you had unanimity among the permanent members of the UN Security Council, including Russia and China, which are reluctant about using sanctions. why was there unanimity? Because Iran continued to ignore and defy the UN Security Council resolutions. This is not dictated by the U.S. As the Iraq WMD fiasco illustrated, the United States cannot always get its way with the UN Security Council. Other countries have a veto. The majority of the Security Council can block action. But in this case, Iran again and again ignored what the UN Security Council said Iran had to do to restore trust, to provide adequate transparency. Now, Mr. says that the sanctions are targeted at the Iranian people. I would take vigorous exception to that. The sanctions are targeted at those entities and individuals in Iran who have specifically defied Iran's obligations. And the legitimate point is that because of some of the bank sanctions and the difficulty of transferring money, there is suffering in Iran. This is in spite of the fact that the U.S. Congress has made exceptions for medicines and humanitarian matters to make sure that these kind of victims do not suffer. But that's something in which the intent is not always, the reality is not always what was intended, but it's not because there's a deliberate effort to hurt the Iranian people.
Actually, well, Greg, can I ask you, I mean, on that point about sanctions, it clearly and historically sanctions have always affected the populations of countries more than the leadership. And, you know, we've seen that with Cuba. We've seen that you could name a number of situations where that's the case. Washington can't have expected the authorities to be affected by sanctions, but the people of Iran would be.
Well, it's true that no one who has any understanding of the history of sanctions would suggest that it would be in the interests of the people of the country being targeted. One thing that has happened, though, is the U.S. has tried to be more specific about sanctions, to be more targeted, so that the entities and the individuals that are supposed to suffer the most are those who are responsible for the decisions that are in defiance of the international community. You can get into a long argument about whether sanctions are effective or ineffective. There are certainly cases like South Africa where most people agree that sanctions played an important role in getting where the international community ultimately needed to get. And I think you can make a strong case that in the absence of sanctions, Iran did not show much of an interest in even sitting down at the negotiating table. So they are playing, I think, an important role here. It's also important to concede, though, that sanctions are a means, and there are a lot of people in the U.S. Congress who seem to think that the only thing we have to do here is to continue to strengthen sanctions, and that will lead directly to an agreement. That may open a door, but you still need negotiations. You still need a search for a win-win solution on both sides.
I'll put that to our guest in Moscow, Andrei Baklitsky. I mean, how do you see the issue of sanctions? Where does Moscow stand on that? They are a key, pivotal role in coming to some kind of solution here, but they must be looking at these sanctions with a bit of unease, surely, especially given Russia's investment in Iran in the past. And, of course, I'm referring to the nuclear plant at Bushehr, which was Russian-built.
Concerning the Bushehr nuclear power plant, as you can see, the construction of the power plant was continued even after the sanctions were imposed by the Security Council, even after the international community was widely against it, because what Russia is trying to do is to separate the legal procedures and interest from each other when there are some problems, some concerns with Iranian nuclear profile, when the IAEA is saying that, look, Iran is probably violating this point, it's not implying this 3.1 modified code. Well, there is an issue, so the Security Council should act as a highest authority in international law. And there are some sanctions imposed in order to show Iran that there is a need to talk, there is a really pressing issue. But at the same time, Russia is against unilateral sanctions, which are at the moment imposed by the United States, by the European Union, and so on. and Russia is clearly against stopping all of the projects, like breaking all of the ties and just going on for hard stand and hard lines and like acting like enemy. The issue here is not to punish Iran, is not to punish its leadership or its people. The issue is try to strike a deal, as Mr. Tillman said, to strike a win-win deal. So while you are pushing for something, for example, you're blocking the assets of the entities which are involved in nuclear program, you should continue, for example, with infrastructure, with aid, if you're providing some aid, with the medicine, and so on and so forth. So you should not really make it harmful in all the dimensions. There is a problem, a nuclear problem. It should be discussed, it should be, well, dealt with, but it doesn't mean you should become enemies while you show Iran there are some problems with this nuclear program.
Okay, well, look, we're discussing Iran's nuclear program and talks later this month in Kazakhstan, hoping to come to some kind of agreements between the West and Iran over their nuclear program. But we'll return to this discussion after a short news update.
European Union leaders are gathering for a two-day summit in Brussels to try and strike a 7-year spending deal. It comes after leaders at a previous meeting in November failed to reach an agreement. The British Prime Minister says he will not accept an EU budget deal unless proposed spending cuts are reduced. US President Barack Obama's new CIA chief is being confirmed in the role at a Senate hearing. John Brennan is a controversial choice because he's seen as having masterminded Obama's drone war. The killing of thousands of people in drone attacks in Pakistan and Yemen is being investigated by the UN. At least 51 people have been killed in a bus crash in Zambia. The vehicle collided with a truck north of the capital of Lusaka. Police say the crash involved a bus run by Zambia's postal service. The assassination of an anti-Islamist politician has sparked violent protests in Tunisia. The country's opposition leader was killed earlier this week. The Prime Minister then announced plans for a new technocratic government. The UK's coalition government has reversed plans to replace GCSE examinations. The Education Secretary said intentions to replace them with English baccalaureate certificates has been scrapped. GCSEs had been previously condemned by Michael Gove, who now said the plans were a bridge too far. And investigations found the use of banned drugs in professional Australian sport is widespread. The report revealed in some cases the drugs were supplied by organised crime syndicates. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Juliet Spare.
This is The Voice of Russia, broadcasting from the heart of London. From Monday to Friday, we're live here on digital from 4 p.m. until 8. We're also online at ruvr.co.uk. Tune in for current affairs, news, arts and debate.
This is The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Brendan Cole. We're discussing Iran's nuclear program. I'd like to get your view, Saeed Ali Alavi, here, Iranian scholar and analyst, about how Israel fits into this spat over Iran's nuclear program. I mean, what do you make of the role of Israel, say, in the last few months? We've had an Israeli election. We've had a degree of brinksmanship in terms of war of words on both sides. I mean, how does it fit in terms of coming to some kind of resolution? Is Iran finding it more and more difficult to come to an agreement, given some of the strong language on Israel's side?
Israel's bomb Iran syndrome, I use this expression, bomb Iran syndrome is not logical. There is no concrete proof that Iran has nuclear weapons. Iran has offered beyond its obligations under the NPT, but Israel still is irrationally convinced that Iran is a threat. And Israel itself has not signed the NPT yet. Mr. Netanyahu particularly has been trying to deflect attention away from his government's economic failure, immigration crisis, and particularly belligerence by portraying Iran as a threat, and is routinely exaggerating about Iran's nuclear program. So that creates more obstacles and makes everything more difficult, particularly about the negotiations between Iran and 5+1 groups talks.
Well, I wanted to talk to our guest here, Greg Thielman, a senior fellow at the Arms Control Association, about some of those comments we just heard from Saeed Ali Alavi about Israel, and whether there is a double standard, whether they are Israel is being irrational about the threat from Iran. What would you make of that?
Well, on irrationality, I think the Israelis are responding the way a lot of countries would respond to the statements by Iranian leadership that the Israeli government should.
Welcome back. This is the Voice of Russia in London. I'm Brendan Cole. Today, Iran's supreme leader has dismissed a US offer of one-to-one talks on Teheran's nuclear program. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei said the US was proposing talks while pointing a gun at Iran. On Saturday, the US Vice President Joe Biden suggested that direct talks, separate to the wider international discussions due to take later this month. But yesterday, the US widened sanctions on Iran, aiming to tighten a squeeze on Tehran's ability to spend oil cash. Iran has argued that its nuclear program is for energy generation and research. But critics believe the government is developing nuclear weapons. Earlier this week, I spoke to Dr. Saeed Hossein Mousavian. He was the senior nuclear negotiator for Iran between 2003 and 2005, and he gave me this view regarding the link between sanctions and Iran's nuclear program.
I really don't know how far Europe and US is ready for lifting the sanctions. I'm pessimistic because I do not see any potential in US domestic policy for lifting substantive sanctions. And as far as they are going to keep the main sanctions, then they should not expect Iran to respond with concessions.
The 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, plus Germany, have held a series of negotiations over the years. Iran is expected to attend another round of negotiations on the 26th of February in Kazakhstan. But will they end again with Iran
demands and allegations? It sounds like an ongoing and endless procedure. This is easy to put forward accusations, but proving them is another issue. The fact is the main issue and obstacle is mutual lack of trust. So, also, Iran has offered beyond its obligations under the NPT. But, for instance, Israel is irrationally convinced that Iran is a threat. And needless to mention that Israel has never signed the NPT yet.
The NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty?
Yes, absolutely. Mm-hmm. But we need to see after all these negotiations, and also I should say, Iran's supreme leader has had issued a verdict that manufacturing the nuclear weapon is forbidden in Islam. So all these negotiations, all these verdicts and goodwill of gesture resulted in more tightened and imposing more sanctions on Iranian people.
Are you saying that the edict from the Ayatollah, who's the supreme leader of Iran, is not being listened to? The religious aspect of that it's against Islam, it's ungodly, or however you like to call it, that is enough, that would forbid any development of a nuclear weapon, and the West should be listening to that? Yes,
obviously yes. And on the other hand, they have been ignoring, the Western Bloc, and particularly Washington, have been ignoring all this goodwill of
demanding the West lift sanctions as a condition to any nuclear move, and the Western powers refusing. Well, to discuss this and the issues surrounding it, I'm joined in our London studio by Saeed Ali Alavi. He's an Iranian scholar and analyst, and we'll be joined by our guests in Washington and in Moscow a bit later on. I'd like to get your reaction, Saeed. What do you think of the Ayatollah's statement today with regard to dismissing the possibility of talking directly with the US?
Iran's supreme leader has drawn a clear and logical framework. And there are reasons for that. Iran had talks with the United States on Afghanistan in Bonn and on Iraq in Baghdad. And regarding nuclear, each time Iran clear an ambiguity, Tehran faces with new